The House Financial Services Committee hearing room fell silent as Representative Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat, a stack of documents in hand. For weeks, House Majority Leader Tom Emmer had been leading the charge against new consumer protection regulations, claiming they would crush small community banks in rural America. His passionate speeches had dominated cable news coverage, painting a picture of regulatory overreach. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter these documents into the record," Crockett said calmly, her voice cutting through the tension. The committee chairman nodded, and Crockett continued. "These are the quarterly reports from the top 5 banks in Representative Emmer's district. Each one shows record profits while raising fees on the very constituents he claims to protect." Emmer's confident smile faded as Crockett held up a chart comparing bank executive compensation to customer fee increases. What happened in the next few minutes wouldn't just leave Emmer speechless. It would transform the entire debate on banking regulation and expose a pattern of saying one thing while doing another. Before we dive into this remarkable exchange that has Washington still buzzing weeks later, take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our exclusive coverage of political accountability moments that the mainstream media often overlooks. Representatives Jasmine Crockett and Tom Emmer represented two fundamentally different approaches to public service and political leadership. Emmer, first elected to Congress in 2014 from Minnesota's 6th District, had quickly risen through Republican ranks to become House Majority Leader by building a reputation as a skilled political operator. A former radio talk show host with a smooth delivery and camera-ready presence, Emmer had mastered the art of simplified messaging that played well in media soundbites. "Tom knows how to make complex issues sound simple," one Republican strategist noted. "He can take a 700-page bill and reduce it to a punchy talking point that resonates with voters who don't have time to dive into policy details." Emmer's rapid ascent to leadership came largely through his fundraising prowess and loyalty to party messaging, rather than legislative accomplishments. Congressional records showed that in his 9 years in office, only 3 bills bearing his name had been signed into law, 2 renaming post offices, and 1 extending an existing program. Instead, his influence came from his ability to unite Republican messaging and secure media attention. Crockett took a different path. Before entering politics, she had spent over a decade as a civil rights attorney, defending vulnerable clients and developing a reputation for meticulous case preparation. After serving in the Texas state legislature, where she authored significant criminal justice reform legislation, she was elected to Congress with a promise to bring evidence-based policymaking to Washington. "Representative Crockett doesn't just speak about issues, she studies them," remarked a senior Treasury Department official who had testified before her committee. "She reads the footnotes, examines the methodology, and questions assumptions that others take for granted." While Emmer had become known for broad statements about Main Street values and American entrepreneurship, Crockett built her reputation on detailed policy analysis and fact-based questioning. Her background as a trial attorney shaped her approach to congressional hearings, where she typically arrived with color-coded binders full of research and specific questions. The Banking Consumer Protection Act, currently being debated in Congress, had become the flashpoint for their different approaches. The bill proposed new restrictions on overdraft fees, credit card interest rates, and predatory lending practices while requiring greater transparency in banking fees. Emmer had become the bill's most visible opponent, appearing on numerous cable news shows to denounce it as regulatory overkill that will destroy community banking. In floor speeches, he frequently cited the potential harm to hard-working Americans in places like Albany and St. Cloud, towns in his Minnesota district. What viewers at home don't know about our political system often matters more than what makes headlines. If you've ever wondered how policy gets shaped behind closed doors, share your thoughts in the comments below about whether politicians should be required to disclose their financial ties to the industries they regulate. Your insights might help shape our future reporting. The quarterly hearing of the House Financial Services Committee had been proceeding routinely until it was Crockett's turn to speak. The cavernous hearing room, with its imposing wooden dais and wall of American flags, was filled with the usual mix of committee members, staff, industry representatives, and a sparse audience of concerned citizens and lobbyists. Emmer had delivered his standard remarks against the Banking Consumer Protection Act earlier in the session, warning that excessive regulation strangles the very institutions that are the backbone of rural and small-town America. He emphasized how the bill would hurt the small banks that know their customers by name and sponsor the Little League teams. When her 15-minute questioning period began, Crockett addressed the panel of banking industry witnesses with a different approach than most committee members had taken that day. "I'd like to focus on actual data rather than hypotheticals," she began, her tone measured but firm. "First, could I direct the committee's attention to Exhibit A in the packets I've distributed?" The room rustled as committee members flipped through the substantial document she had prepared. On the screen behind her appeared a detailed map of Minnesota's 6th congressional district with banks color-coded by size. "This map shows the 46 banking institutions in Representative Emmer's district," Crockett explained. "Of these, 38 are branches of the nation's 6 largest banking corporations. Only 8 are what would qualify as community banks under the Federal Reserve's definition." She turned a page in her binder. "Now let's look at what the Banking Consumer Protection Act actually requires versus what it exempts." A side-by-side comparison appeared on screen. Section 231 through 249 specifically exempts banks with assets under $10 billion from 80% of the new compliance requirements. All 8 community banks in Representative Emmer's district fall well below this threshold. The banking industry witnesses shifted uncomfortably as Crockett continued methodically through her presentation. In fact, the regulations Representative Emmer claims will crush community banks don't apply to them at all. They target practices like the $35 overdraft fees and 29.99% credit card interest rates charged primarily by the megabanks that dominate his district. Crockett then held up another document. "I'd like to enter into the record the campaign finance reports from the last 3 election cycles." She paused as the clerk took the papers. "These show that Representative Emmer has received $3.2 million from the 6 largest banks and their industry PACs, the very institutions that would actually be affected by this legislation, while receiving only $18,500 from the community banks he claims to be protecting." The committee room, which had been filled with the usual background murmurs and side conversations, grew noticeably quieter. "Now I'd like to direct the committee to Exhibit C," Crockett continued, "which contains the quarterly earnings reports from the major banks operating in Minnesota's 6th district. These show that in the past year, while Representative Emmer was claiming that regulation would harm banks' ability to serve their customers, these institutions collectively raised consumer fees by an average of 26% while posting record profits of $14.2 billion. She turned to face Emmer directly across the committee dais. "Representative Emmer, would you care to explain why you've been telling your constituents that this bill would hurt community banks when it explicitly exempts them? Or why you claim to be protecting consumers while banks in your district raise fees to record levels while making record profits?" The chamber went completely still as all eyes turned to Emmer. Known for his quick responses and media-ready comebacks, the majority leader seemed momentarily frozen, glancing down at his papers. "I yield to the gentleman for a response," Crockett added, formally inviting him to answer. Emmer cleared his throat. "The gentlewoman is mischaracterizing both the legislation and my position," he began, his usual confident tone noticeably strained. "The regulatory burden—" "Pardon me," Crockett interrupted politely but firmly, "but could you specifically address which part of my presentation was a mischaracterization? Was it the map of banks in your district, the exemption language in the bill, the campaign finance reports, or the bank profit statements? All of these are public records." Emmer attempted to pivot. "The issue is more complex than just numbers on a page. The real-world impact—" Crockett held up a letter. "Speaking of real-world impact, I have here a letter from the Minnesota Credit Union Network representing the actual community financial institutions in your district. They've officially endorsed the Banking Consumer Protection Act, stating that it would level the playing field against large banks while protecting consumers from predatory practices." Would you like to comment on why you oppose legislation that the community banks in your district actually support? Visibly uncomfortable, Emmer shuffled through his papers. I haven't seen that particular letter, but I maintain that this legislation goes too far. Too far for whom? Crockett asked. For your constituents paying the overdraft fees? Or for the banks funding your campaigns? Before Emmer could respond, Crockett changed direction. Let me ask about something else. You've mentioned the impact on hard-working Americans in your district 13 times in floor speeches about this bill. I have here the Consumer Complaint Database from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, showing that residents of your district filed 2,187 complaints against the major banks operating there in the past year alone. These complaints detail excessive fees, unexplained interest rate hikes, and predatory loan terms, exactly the practices this bill would regulate. She looked up from her documents. Have you met with any of these constituents who filed complaints? Have you heard their stories directly? My office handles constituent services, Emmer began. That wasn't my question, Crockett interjected. Have you personally met with constituents harmed by these banking practices, the same way you've met with banking industry executives? According to your public schedule, you've attended 24 private meetings with banking industry executives in the past year, including a fundraiser at the Ritz-Carlton hosted by the American Bankers Association PAC 2 weeks before you began publicly opposing this bill. The committee chairman, sensing the mounting tension, tapped his gavel. The gentlewoman's time is nearly expired. Crockett nodded acknowledgement. One final question, then. Representative Emmer, the record shows you supported similar regulations under a different name in the Minnesota State Legislature before coming to Congress. What changed between then and now, other than $3.2 million in campaign contributions? As the chairman's gavel came down signaling the end of her time, the room remained unusually silent. For perhaps the first time in his political career, Tom Emmer, known for never being at a loss for words, had no immediate response. The cameras that had been broadcasting the hearing captured his rare moment of speechlessness, a stark contrast to his usual media-savvy persona. The impact of Crockett's methodical dismantling of Emmer's position was both immediate and far-reaching. As the committee recessed for lunch, reporters swarmed Crockett in the hallway outside, while Emmer slipped out a side door, his staff forming a protective barrier against questions. I believe representatives should represent their constituents, not their donors, Crockett told the gathered press, her tone matter-of-fact rather than triumphant. This isn't about politics. It's about honesty in public service. Within hours, video clips of the exchange spread across social media platforms. News outlets that had previously accepted Emmer's framing of the banking bill began running fact-check pieces examining his claims against Crockett's evidence. Fact check. Are community banks exempt from Banking Consumer Protection Act? Read one headline. Map. Which banks would actually be affected by new regulations? Read another, featuring Crockett's district map. The Minnesota Star-Tribune, the largest newspaper covering Emmer's district, ran a front-page story titled, Questions Raised About Emmer's Banking Bill Opposition, alongside a chart comparing bank profits to consumer fee increases in the district. By that evening, consumer advocacy groups had created online dashboards showing banking complaint data for every congressional district, allowing voters to see how many of their neighbors had filed complaints against financial institutions. The banking industry's carefully crafted narrative began to crumble as other representatives, seeing the public reaction to Crockett's presentation, began asking similar questions about banks in their own districts. The pivotal moment came the following morning when the committee reconvened to continue debate on the bill. A Republican representative from a rural Oklahoma district asked for recognition. Mr. Chairman, she began, in light of the information presented yesterday about the bill's exemptions for smaller banks, I've had my staff verify the provisions overnight. It appears that concerns about impacts on community banking may have been overstated. The banks in my district with less than $10 billion in assets would largely be exempt from these regulations. She continued, her comments sending ripples through the committee room. I've also taken the time to review consumer complaints from my constituents, and I cannot in good conscience oppose protections they clearly need. While I may propose some amendments, I believe the core of this bill deserves bipartisan support. Two other Republican committee members made similar statements, fundamentally shifting the balance of power on the committee. What had been a party line issue suddenly became more fluid, with representatives responding to the clear evidence Crockett had presented. Behind the scenes, banking lobbyists scrambled to regain control of the narrative. Internal industry emails later obtained by journalists revealed their panic. Crockett's presentation has completely reframed the debate. We need to find a new angle ASAP. But the most telling response came from Emmer himself. When he finally addressed the media later that day, gone was his usual confident stance against the job-killing regulations. Instead, he offered a noticeably softened position. After reviewing the specific provisions of the bill more thoroughly, he said, choosing his words carefully, I recognize that there are consumer protections worth preserving while we also ensure banking sector stability. I look forward to working with colleagues on both sides to improve this legislation. Political analysts immediately recognized the significant retreat from his previous hardline opposition. What we're seeing is a textbook example of what happens when rhetoric collides with facts, noted a veteran Washington observer. Representative Emmer had been speaking in generalities about harmful regulations, but Representative Crockett came armed with specifics that simply couldn't be dismissed. For Crockett, the vindication continued as community banks in Emmer's district began speaking out. The president of First State Bank of Middleville, one of the few independent banks remaining in Minnesota's 6th district, gave an interview stating, We've been saying for years that the real problem isn't regulation of predatory practices. It's the unfair advantage that megabanks have. This bill would actually help banks like ours compete while protecting our customers. Consumer stories began emerging as well. Local news stations in Emmer's district featured interviews with constituents who had faced excessive overdraft fees or predatory interest rates. I sent multiple complaints to my congressman's office about these banking practices, one elderly resident told reporters, holding up bank statements showing hundreds of dollars in fees. I never received a response. By the end of the week, the Banking Consumer Protection Act had gained 7 new Republican co-sponsors, completely transforming its prospects for passage. Industry analysts began publishing revised projections acknowledging that some form of the consumer protections would likely become law. For Emmer, the political consequences were equally significant. His leadership position, built largely on his ability to craft compelling messages against Democratic initiatives, had been undermined by Crockett's factual deconstruction of his claims. Republican colleagues who had once deferred to his messaging guidance began conducting their own analyses of legislation rather than simply adopting his talking points. What Representative Crockett did wasn't just win a policy debate, observed a senior congressional staffer. She exposed the gap between political messaging and policy reality that too often goes unchallenged in Washington. The ripple effects of the Crockett-Emmer confrontation extended far beyond that single committee hearing, ultimately transforming both legislative processes and political accountability in ways few could have predicted. 3 weeks after the exchange, the Banking Consumer Protection Act passed the House with a surprisingly bipartisan vote of 276-159, including 42 Republicans who crossed party lines, an almost unheard-of breakdown in an era of strict party discipline. The bill maintained its strong consumer protections while incorporating thoughtful amendments that addressed legitimate operational concerns raised by community banks. For Emmer, the long-term impact was profound. Local newspapers in his Minnesota district, which had previously given him favorable coverage, began scrutinizing his statements more carefully. The St. Cloud Times launched a regular fact-check feature called Rhetoric versus Reality that compared politicians' claims against verifiable data. Representative Emmer has built his career on being media savvy, but that approach falters when confronted with well-researched facts, noted a political science professor at the University of Minnesota. The Crockett exchange revealed that much of what passes for political debate is actually messaging disconnected from policy details. Perhaps most significantly, Emmer's donor base began to shift. Campaign finance reports filed in the following quarter showed a 62% decrease in banking industry contributions to his campaign, while his small-dollar donations from individual constituents increased dramatically. Political analysts suggested this represented a fundamental realignment of his political incentives. Sensing this shift, Emmer began adjusting his approach to legislation. In committee hearings, he arrived better prepared with specific policy points rather than broad generalizations. His public statements incorporated more nuance and acknowledgement of policy trade-offs. During a town hall meeting in his district, he even acknowledged the change directly. "I'll be honest with you," he told constituents. "The exchange with Representative Crockett was a wake-up call for me. I've spent too much time focused on messaging and not enough time on the details that actually affect your lives. That's going to change." For Crockett, the aftermath brought a different kind of transformation. Rather than using her newfound national profile to seek media attention, she doubled down on her methodical, evidence-based approach to legislation. The Crockett method became a term used by congressional staffers to describe thorough preparation before committee hearings. Several freshman representatives explicitly modeled their approach after hers, focusing on detailed policy analysis rather than political posturing. What Representative Crockett demonstrated wasn't just how to win a political exchange, explained a congressional fellow. She showed how fact-based oversight can actually improve legislation. Both sides realized that better-crafted bills serve everyone's interests in the long run. The banking industry itself underwent a strategic reassessment. Internal memos from industry associations, later published by financial journalists, revealed a new approach. The Crockett confrontation has changed the playbook. Vague warnings about regulatory harm are no longer effective. We need to engage with specific policy provisions and acknowledge legitimate consumer concerns. Major banks began voluntarily reducing their most excessive fees, recognizing that the political climate had shifted against practices that couldn't be publicly defended with specific facts. Beyond Washington, the exchange sparked broader conversations about political accountability in a complex world. Journalism schools began using video of the Crockett-Emmer exchange in media literacy courses, highlighting the difference between analyzing policy details and simply amplifying political messaging. We're teaching aspiring journalists that their job isn't just to quote what politicians say, but to compare those statements against verifiable facts, said a journalism professor at Columbia University. The Crockett-Emmer exchange is a perfect case study in why this matters. Civic education programs likewise incorporated the confrontation into their curriculum on effective citizenship. Students need to understand that democracy requires informed participation, explained an education specialist. When representatives know their constituents are paying attention to details, not just sound bites, the quality of governance improves. 18 months later, as Congress debated a different financial regulation bill, the lasting impact of the Crockett-Emmer exchange was clear. Representatives from both parties arrived at hearings with detailed analyses rather than talking points. Industry witnesses faced more specific, fact-based questioning. Most notably, the tone of the debate shifted from partisan accusations to substantive policy discussions. During one such hearing, a freshman representative was asked by a reporter about her rigorous questioning style. "I watched the Crockett-Emmer exchange during my campaign," she explained. "It showed me that effective representation isn't about who can craft the cleverest soundbite. It's about who does the work to understand how policy actually affects people's lives." For Tom Emmer, the experience ultimately proved transformative rather than destructive. Though initially painful, his public reckoning led to a more substantive approach to legislation that ironically strengthened his position within Congress. Representative Emmer 2.0, as some staffers called him, became known for thoughtful policy positions rather than merely effective messaging. The following election cycle, his campaign materials featured specific accomplishments and policy positions rather than vague value statements. "I learned that voters respect honesty and substance," he told a local reporter. "Even when we disagree, people appreciate knowing exactly where I stand and why." Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, continued her methodical approach to legislation, building a reputation that transcended partisan divisions. What happened with Representative Emmer wasn't about scoring political points, she reflected in a later interview. It was about ensuring that our debates are grounded in facts rather than fiction. That's not a Democratic or Republican value, it's an American one. Perhaps the most profound legacy emerged 2 years later, when a new congressional norm began taking shape. Representatives increasingly declined to take public positions on complex legislation until they had personally reviewed the text and consulted with affected constituents. This simple but revolutionary change, putting substance before messaging, traced its origins directly to the moment when Crockett challenged Emmer to defend his rhetoric with facts. The Crockett-Emmer exchange reminds us that in a healthy democracy, facts still matter, concluded a political historian. When our debates focus on substance rather than spectacle, everyone wins, not just one party or the other, but the American people as a whole. If you found this examination of political accountability valuable, please like this video and subscribe to stay informed about how our democratic institutions actually function. Turn on notifications to receive updates on our ongoing coverage of the tension between political rhetoric and substantive governance, the essential foundation of effective democracy.